The morning of August 17th, 1943, on Kiska Island in the Aleutian Chain, Sergeant Robert Mitchell from the 7th Infantry Division approached the abandoned Japanese tank carefully, his M1 Garand rifle ready. The fog had lifted enough to reveal what American forces had been searching for since landing 2 days earlier. A Type 95 Hargo light tank, olive drab paint dulled by months of harsh Aleutian weather, sat motionless near a supply depot the Japanese had evacuated weeks before. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Mitchell had heard stories about these tanks from Marines fighting in the South Pacific. They were fast, maneuverable, and according to intelligence reports, the backbone of Japanese armored forces. His unit had expected a fight for Kiska. Instead, they found an empty island and equipment, the frightful unmanned FAPE Japanese couldn't take with them when they withdrew. 2 of these tanks, intact and operational, were among the prizes. Within hours, engineers swarmed the captured vehicles. They photographed every detail, measured every dimension, and prepared them for shipment to Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. The tanks would be studied, tested, and eventually, they would reveal a secret that would change how American forces viewed Japanese armor for the rest of the war. But that revelation would not come from sophisticated ballistics testing or engineering analysis. It would come from something far simpler, something that would make Marines across the Pacific shake their heads in disbelief when they heard about it. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Hargo was not an accident of Japanese military planning. It was the deliberate answer to a specific problem the time. Imperial Japanese Army faced in 1933. The Type 89 medium tank, Japan's primary armored vehicle at the time, could manage only 15 miles per hour. For supporting infantry at walking pace, this was adequate. For the mechanized warfare Japanese planners envisioned, it was utterly insufficient. The Army Technical Bureau issued specifications in July 1933. The new tank would weigh approximately 7 tons, mount a 37mm gun, achieve speeds of 40 kilometers per hour, and have armor sufficient to resist rifle and machine gun fire. Most importantly, it would be simple enough for Japan's industrial base to produce in quantities adequate for the wars to come. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries received the contract. Engineer Tomio Hara, who had already established his reputation designing the Type 89, accepted the challenge. His most notable innovation was the bell crank suspension system, an elegantly simple design that would become standard on Japanese tanks for the next decade. By June 1934, Mitsubishi completed the first prototype. Military observers were impressed during field trials conducted in Manchuria and at proving grounds throughout Japan. The tank was fast, reaching 45 kilometers per hour on paved roads and maintaining 25 to 30 kilometers cross-country. It was maneuverable, with a turning radius that seemed impossible for a tracked vehicle of its size. The suspension, despite its distinctive roughness, absorbed shocks adequately and allowed the tank to traverse terrain that would have stopped other vehicles. And it was mechanically reliable, powered by a Mitsubishi 6-cylinder air-cooled diesel engine, producing 120 horsepower at 1,800 revolutions per minute. The diesel engine was a particular point of pride for Japanese engineers. It made the tank less vulnerable to fires than gasoline-powered vehicles, and diesel fuel was more readily available throughout Japan's expanding empire. Engineers made modifications after initial trials. The suspension had a tendency to pitch violently on rough ground, making aiming while moving nearly impossible and causing severe crew fatigue. They addressed this by adding braces to connect the bogie pairs, creating what became known as the Manchurian suspension. The modification helped, though it never completely eliminated the rough ride that would characterize the Hargo throughout its service life. In 1935, the Type 95 was formally presented as the main tank for mechanized infantry units. There was debate. Infantry representatives argued that 12 millimeters of armor was insufficient for a tank supporting assaults against fortified positions. Cavalry representatives countered that improved speed and mobility compensated for thin armor, and that the tank's firepower was adequate for its intended role. After considerable discussion, the infantry agreed to accept the design. The Type 95 Hargo was officially adopted. The designation came from the Japanese imperial calendar, marking the 2595th year since the legendary founding of Japan. Only the last two digits were used in the type number. Production began at Mitsubishi facilities in 1936. The Hargo was indeed a small tank. It measured just 4.38 meters long, 2.06 meters wide, and 2.13 meters tall. In American measurements, that was 14 feet 4 inches long, 6 feet 9 inches wide, and just under 7 feet tall. A man of average height could look over the turret. The weight came in at 7.4 tons for the basic tank, reaching 8.1 tons when loaded with crew, fuel, and ammunition. The armor was thin by any standard, 12 millimeters at its thickest points on the turret and upper hull, 9 millimeters on the roof and floor, 6 millimeters in some, less critical areas. Japanese designers had calculated this was sufficient to stop rifle and machine gun bullets at combat ranges. They were designing for the enemies they expected to fight: Chinese forces with limited anti-tank capability, light Soviet tanks encountered at borders disputes. The armor would protect against the threats they anticipated facing. Inside, the tank was cramped. The crew consisted of 3 men. The driver sat in the front left of the hull, with limited vision through a small viewport and periscope. A hull machine gunner sat to the driver's right, operating a Type 97 7.7mm machine gun mounted in a ball mount. The commander occupied the turret alone, standing on the hull floor with no turret basket beneath his feet. This commander had perhaps one of the most difficult jobs in the Imperial Japanese Army. He had to command the tank, directing the driver, and communicating with other tanks when radio was available. Only one tank in, 4 had a radio set, leaving the others to follow visual signals. He had to operate the main gun, a Type 98 37mm cannon capable of firing both high-explosive and armor-piercing rounds. He had to load that gun, a physical task made difficult by the cramped space and the need to stand while doing so. And he had to operate a second machine gun mounted in the rear of the turret, facing to the right rear at roughly the 5 o'clock position. American tankers who later examined captured Hargos marveled that anyone could function effectively under such conditions. The Japanese commander had no seat in the turret. He stood throughout combat, his head and shoulders exposed if he opened the hatch for better vision, or confined to a small space with minimal visibility if he closed it. The turret rotated by hand crank, requiring significant physical effort. There was barely room to move, let alone fight efficiently. But in its intended role, against the opponents it was designed to fight, the Hargo performed well. Very well indeed. The tank first saw significant action in China starting in 1937 against Chinese forces that had virtually no armor and limited anti-tank weapons. The Hargo was devastating. Its 37mm gun could destroy fortifications and suppress infantry. Its machine guns cut down troops in the open. Its mobility allowed it to exploit breakthroughs and pursue retreating forces. Japanese tank crews gained combat experience and confidence. They learned their trade in an environment where their tanks were clearly superior to anything they faced. This success bred a dangerous assumption, that the Hargo was a genuinely capable tank, rather than a vehicle optimized for a specific, limited scenario. The assumption was tested at Khalkhin Gol in 1939, where Japanese forces clashed with the Soviet Union along the Mongolian border. Here, the Hargo faced real opposition: Soviet BT-5 and BT-7, tanks mounted 45mm guns with better armor penetration than the Japanese 37mm. Soviet armor was thicker, making frontal engagements difficult for the Hargo. The battles were brutal. On July 2, 1939, the Japanese 3rd Tank Regiment, equipped primarily with Type 95 tanks, attacked Soviet positions. The initial assault achieved some success through aggressive tactics and surprise. Japanese tanks destroyed 32 Soviet tanks and captured 35 armored vehicles. But Soviet counterattacks in the following days revealed the Hargo's vulnerabilities. Soviet guns could penetrate the Hargo's armor at ranges where the Japanese guns struggled to damage Soviet tanks. By the end of the Khalkhin Gol campaign, Japan had lost dozens of tanks. The lessons were clear to anyone paying attention. The Hargo was outmatched by modern Soviet armor. Its thin protection and relatively weak gun were not adequate for tank versus tank combat against peer adversaries. But these lessons were not fully absorbed. Japanese military leadership focused instead on tactical improvements and crew training, rather than fundamental redesign of their armored forces. The war in China continued, and there the Hargo remained effective. When war broke out across the Pacific in December 1941, Japanese tank units achieved remarkable successes. In Malaya, Hargo tanks navigated terrain British commanders thought impossible for armour. They moved through rubber plantations and jungle trails, supporting the rapid Japanese advance down the peninsula toward Singapore. British forces, who had not deployed significant armour to Malaya, were unprepared for this mobile threat. In the Philippines, Hargos landed with the invasion force and supported Japanese infantry operations. On December 22, 1941, north of Damortis, Type 95 tanks engaged American M3 Stuart light tanks in what would be recorded as the first tank versus tank battle involving US forces in the Pacific. Both tanks mounted 37mm guns. The M3 had better armour, 32mm on the turret sides compared to the Hargo's 12mm. But at close range in jungle fighting, the Japanese achieved some success, destroying one M3 in the initial engagement. These early victories reinforced Japanese confidence. From their perspective, the Hargo was performing exactly as designed. It was mobile, reliable, and effective in supporting infantry operations across diverse terrain. Tank crews trusted their machines, commanders relied on their armour, and when the tide of war turned against Japan, when American forces began their island-hopping campaign across the Pacific, Japanese tank units would discover that the same vehicles that had crushed Chinese infantry and outmaneuvered British colonial forces were woefully inadequate against an enemy with proper equipment and industrial might. The two Hargos, captured on Kiska, arrived at Aberdeen Proving Ground in September 1943. The facility, established in 1918 on the shores of Chesapeake Bay in Maryland, was the United States Army's primary testing center for ordnance and armor. Captured enemy equipment from both world wars had passed through Aberdeen's gates. German tanks, Italian artillery, Japanese rifles. Each piece was studied, tested, and evaluated. The Hargos were placed in a secure area under 24-hour guard, not to prevent sabotage, though that was a concern, but to prevent souvenir hunters. Every soldier, every mechanic, every engineer wanted a piece of Japanese equipment. The guards had orders to prevent unauthorized access. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Ordnance specialists began their examination. They measured armor thickness at multiple points on the hull and turret, documenting the variations. Front hull 12mm, side hull 12mm, rear hull 10 to 12mm, turret front 12mm, turret sides 12mm, roof plates 9mm, belly armor 6mm. They tested the quality of the steel using metallurgical analysis. The armor was face-hardened, a process that made the outer surface harder than the interior core. This technique was effective against small arms fire, causing bullets to shatter rather than penetrate. But it was ineffective against larger projectiles with sufficient energy to break through the hard outer layer and penetrate the softer interior. They evaluated the internal layout, taking detailed measurements and photographs. The fighting compartment provided barely 50 cubic feet of space for the commander. He had to stand constantly with no seat and no resting position. The turret ring diameter was just 1,200 millimeters, leaving minimal space for a man to work while also operating weapons, loading ammunition, and commanding the tank. American tankers who examined the Hargos could not imagine fighting in such conditions. Sherman crews, by comparison, had a fighting compartment that provided over 150 cubic feet of working space. Each crew member had a defined position with proper seating. The commander had a cupola with all-around vision blocks. The gunner had a telescopic sight and power traverse for the turret. The loader had space to move and access to properly organized ammunition racks. But the most significant discovery at Aberdeen was not about the Hargo's cramped interior or its awkward crew arrangements. It was about the armor itself, specifically about what could defeat it. Ballistics specialists at Aberdeen had access to comprehensive data on American ammunition performance. They knew, down to precise measurements, what every round fired by US forces could penetrate at various ranges. They had charts, tables, and test results from thousands of firing trials. When they compared this data to the Hargo's armor specifications, they discovered something that would prove strategically important. The 12mm armor that protected the Hargo, the same armor Japanese designers had specified to defeat rifle and machine gun bullets, could be penetrated by standard American small arms ammunition, not just anti-tank weapons, not just heavy artillery, small arms ammunition. The 30.06 M2 armor-piercing round, standard ammunition for American rifles and machine guns, could penetrate 12.7 millimeters of MILA 12,560 armor steel from 100 yards. The Hargo's armor was 12 millimeters. The mathematics were simple and devastating. At close range, American rifle-caliber weapons could defeat Japanese tank armor. The 50 caliber M2 armor-piercing round, fired from the Browning M2 heavy machine gun, could penetrate 23 millimeters of armor at 200 meters, nearly twice the thickness of the Hargo's maximum protection. At the ranges where Pacific Island combat typically occurred, the 50 caliber had more than enough penetrating power. But there was another weapon, less powerful than the 50 caliber but far more common throughout American forces. The 30 caliber M1000 919 Browning machine gun, mounted on vehicles, used as infantry support, present in virtually every American unit. This gun fired the same 30.06 ammunition as the M1 Garand rifle. When loaded with M2 armor-piercing rounds, the M1919 could defeat the Hargo's armor at combat ranges. The implications were profound. American forces didn't need specialized anti-tank weapons to engage Japanese tanks. They didn't need to call for artillery support or airstrikes. Marines with standard infantry weapons, firing standard ammunition, could penetrate Japanese tank armor. The ballistics report from Aberdeen was classified and distributed to Marine and Army units preparing for operations in the Pacific. The information reached combat units in late 1943 and early 1944. Some commanders were skeptical. Tanks were supposed to be immune to small arms fire. That was the fundamental premise of armored warfare. The armor kept the crew alive while they engaged the enemy with superior firepower. But the numbers were clear. The Hargo's armor was too thin. Japanese designers had made a calculated decision to prioritize speed and mobility over protection. That decision, rational when fighting Chinese infantry with limited anti-tank capability, was catastrophic when facing American forces with modern weapons and abundant ammunition. The question was whether the theoretical ballistics data would match combat reality. The answer came at Saipan. Saipan, in the Mariana chain, was strategically vital, positioned just 1,250 miles from Tokyo. If the Americans captured Saipan, their B-29 bombers would be within range of the Japanese home islands. The empire's leaders knew this. They fortified Saipan with approximately 30,000 troops, nearly double what American intelligence estimated. Among the defenders was the 9th Tank Regiment, commanded by Colonel Takashi Goto. The regiment was equipped with 44 tanks, a mixture of Type 95 Hargos and the slightly larger Type 97 Chi-Ha medium tanks. The Chi-Has were better armed with 57mm guns, but shared the thin armor that characterized Japanese tank design. These tanks represented a significant armored force by Pacific standards, certainly the largest the Americans had yet faced. The Americans began their assault on June 15, 1944. Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner ordered the landing force ashore at 05:42 hours. By 0700, landing craft were moving toward the beaches. At 0840, the first wave hit the shore. The 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions landed on Saipan's western beaches under heavy fire from Japanese artillery and mortars positioned on the heights overlooking the landing zones. The Marines fought their way inland against fierce resistance. By nightfall of the 15th, 20,000 American combat troops were ashore. Equipment and supplies poured onto the beaches. Among the equipment were M4 Sherman medium tanks, landing from LST vessels and moving forward to support the infantry. The Marines established a beachhead, but it was not yet secure. Japanese artillery could still reach the beaches. Counterattacks continued through the night. On June 16th, the Marines consolidated their positions and began pushing inland. The 2nd Marine Division worked to close gaps in the line, while the 4th Marine Division cleared areas around key terrain. General Holland Smith, commanding the assault force, committed his reserves, bringing elements of the 27th Infantry Division ashore to reinforce the beachhead. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, commanding Japanese forces on Saipan, recognized the critical situation. If the Americans consolidated their beachhead and brought their full combat power ashore, dislodging them would become impossible. He needed to strike before they were fully prepared. Saito issued orders for a major counterattack using the island's most powerful assets: the infantry of the 136th Regiment and the tanks of the 9th Tank Regiment. The attack order was specific. The infantry would assault the American positions around Sharan-Kanoa airfield. The tank unit would advance southwest of Hill 164.6, moving after the infantry attack commenced. The tanks would charge the transmitting station and throw the enemy into disorder before the infantry penetrated the sector. It was an ambitious plan, requiring coordination between infantry and armour in a night, attack across difficult terrain. Colonel Goto gathered his tank crews. They conducted final maintenance checks on their vehicles. Crews loaded ammunition, 37mm rounds for the Hargos, 57mm for the Chihas. They filled fuel tanks, checked track tension, tested the radios on the few tanks that had them. The crews were confident. Many had combat experience from China or earlier Pacific campaigns. They trusted their machines and their tactics. In the pre-dawn darkness of June 17th, the Japanese tank column moved out. Diesel engines coughed to life, their distinctive sound echoing across the landscape. Tracks clanked as the tanks formed up and began their approach toward the American lines. Inside each cramped vehicle, crews felt the familiar vibration and noise of their tanks in motion. Commanders stood in their turrets, trying to see through the darkness, coordinating movement through visual signals. The Americans heard them coming. Marine. Sentries on the perimeter reported engine sounds from the north. Officers shouted orders. Men grabbed weapons and moved to defensive positions. Anti-tank gun crews traversed their 37mm M3 guns toward the approaching sounds. Sherman tank crews who had bedded down near their vehicles climbed aboard and started engines. Machine gun teams checked their weapons and ammunition. At 0330 hours, the Japanese attack began in earnest. 44 tanks, the largest armoured formation yet committed by Japan in the Pacific, advanced toward the 2nd Marine Division's positions. Some tanks carried infantry clinging to the hulls, a dangerous but sometimes effective tactic. The formation moved through the darkness, guided by the lead tanks and following the terrain toward their objectives. Marine riflemen saw them first, dark shapes emerging from the pre-dawn gloom. Then came the distinctive sound of diesel engines at full throttle, tracks throwing dirt and dust, the clank of bogie wheels and the squeal of steel on steel. Japanese tankers could see Marines in their positions, could see the defensive line ahead. Some commanders opened fire with their hull machine guns, sweeping the ground ahead. Others reserved fire, trying to get closer before engaging. Then something happened that no one on either side had fully anticipated, something that would be documented in after-action reports and studied at military schools for decades afterward. Marine machine gunners positioned in foxholes and behind cover had been issued standard ammunition loads for their weapons. For the M1919 30 caliber machine guns, this included ball ammunition for general use and armor-piercing ammunition specifically designed to engage light vehicles and fortifications. The armor-piercing ammunition had been developed for exactly this purpose, to defeat light armor and fortified positions. The rounds featured a hardened steel core designed to penetrate metal and concrete. In testing at American Ordnance Proving Grounds, these rounds had demonstrated the ability to penetrate 13 millimeters of armor steel at moderate ranges. The Hago's armor was 12 millimeters thick. As the Japanese tanks closed with Marine positions, machine gunners began engaging them, not with specialized anti-tank weapons, not with the 50 caliber heavy machine guns, though those were firing as well. With standard 30 caliber M1919 machine guns, firing 30.06 M2 armor-piercing ammunition. The rounds struck the Hagos at ranges of 200 yards and less, and they penetrated. At close range, the 30 caliber armor-piercing rounds didn't just dent the thin Japanese armor, they punched through cleanly, decisively. Some rounds, striking at favorable angles, went completely through one side of the tank and exited the other. Even at longer ranges, the rounds penetrated the armor with energy to spare. Inside the Japanese tanks, crews experienced something far worse than defeat. They experienced revelation. The machine gun fire wasn't just loud impacts on the outside of the hull, it was penetration, rounds coming through the armor, striking crew members, damaging equipment, igniting ammunition. In the cramped interior of a Hago, there was nowhere to hide. A round that penetrated the hull could strike anyone, anywhere. One Marine machine gunner, firing his M1919 from a position near the airfield, reported watching his tracer rounds strike a Hago advancing directly toward him. The rounds hit the front hull. He could see impacts, see the tank react. The tank kept coming for a moment, then slowed, then stopped. Smoke began pouring from the engine compartment. The crew attempted to bail out. 2 men emerged before rifle fire from Marines in nearby foxholes cut them down. Another Marine, manning an M1919 mounted on a half-track, engaged a Hago at approximately 150 yards. He fired sustained bursts into the tank's side armor. The tank turned toward him, exposing more of its flank. He kept firing. His assistant fed another belt of ammunition. Through his sights, he watched the commander in the turret suddenly slump forward, then collapse. The bullet had gone through the thin turret armor, struck the man, and continued through the other side. A third Marine, in a fixed position on the defensive line, engaged multiple tanks as they advanced. He fired at one Hago's engine compartment, aiming for the rear deck where the cooling vents were located. His 30 caliber rounds penetrated the 6mm armor covering the engine. The diesel engine seized, cylinders opened by impacts. The tank stopped moving, becoming a stationary target. The crew abandoned it, running back toward Japanese lines through intense small arms fire. Japanese tank crews who survived the initial assault couldn't process what was happening. They had trained for years. They had fought in China where enemy weapons bounced harmlessly off their armor. They had faced Soviet anti-tank rifles at Khalkhin Gol and survived. Their tanks were supposed to protect them. That was the fundamental premise of armored warfare. The tank's armor kept the crew alive while they engaged the enemy with superior firepower. But American machine guns were defeating their armor. Not anti-tank guns firing large-caliber projectiles. Not artillery. Not even the massive 75mm guns on the Sherman tanks they could see moving into position. Machine guns, infantry support weapons, weapons that were mounted on jeeps, on half-tracks, in every squad throughout the American military. The realization was devastating. If machine guns could penetrate their tanks, what chance did they have? A Japanese tank officer, later captured after his tank was disabled, told American interrogators through interpreters that his first thought was that the Americans must have developed some new secret weapon, some advanced ammunition or special gun that looked like a standard machine gun, but fired exotic projectiles. He simply could not accept that a conventional .30 caliber machine gun could defeat a tank. In his entire combat experience, from training in Manchuria to fighting in China, small arms fire had always been ineffective against armor. Bullets made noise on the outside, they ricocheted off at angles. They didn't come through. But the Browning M1919, firing 30.06 M2 armor-piercing rounds, was in an entirely different category from anything the Japanese had previously encountered. With its armor-piercing ammunition, the M1919 had sufficient energy and penetrating power to defeat 12mm armor at any range where a machine gunner could accurately engage a target. And the Marines had these weapons everywhere. They were standard equipment throughout the American military. As the Japanese tank attack faltered under this unexpected fire, Sherman tanks moved forward to engage. The contrast was stark. Where the Ha-Go weighed 7.4 tons, the M4A2 Sherman, the variant used by Marines at Saipan, weighed 31.8 tons. Where the Ha-Go had 12mm of armor, the Sherman had 51mm on the frontal hull, angled at 56 degrees to provide effective protection equivalent to approximately 75mm against anti-tank fire. The Sherman mounted a 75mm gun as its main armament. This gun could penetrate the Ha-Go's armor from over a mile away. When Shermans opened fire on the Japanese tanks, the outcome was predetermined. 75mm armor-piercing rounds struck Hargos and Chihas with devastating effect. Tanks were blown apart. Turrets were knocked off hulls. Ammunition detonated inside crew compartments. Japanese tanks that returned fire found their 37mm and 57mm rounds completely ineffective against the Sherman's frontal armor. The shells bounced off or created small dents without penetrating. One Japanese tank commander, whose Ha-Go was disabled by .30 caliber fire but whose turret could still traverse, attempted to engage a Sherman at close range. He ordered his gunner to fire. The 37mm gun fired its armor-piercing round. The projectile struck the Sherman's turret face. There was a flash of impact. The Sherman didn't even slow down. It continued to rotate its turret with mechanical precision, aimed, and fired a single 75mm round. The Ha-Go exploded, torn apart by the impact and the detonation of its own ammunition. There was no second chance, no opportunity to withdraw. The engagement lasted perhaps 3 seconds from the Japanese tank firing to its destruction. The battle evolved into what one Marine officer later described as a madhouse of noise, tracers, and flashing lights. Disabled tanks burned, illuminating other tanks still trying to advance. Infantry that had been riding on the tanks scattered, seeking cover in shell holes and drainage ditches. Some Japanese infantry made it to the Marine lines, fighting desperate close-range battles in and around American positions. Marine infantry, hunkered in their foxholes, found themselves with Japanese tanks passing directly over them. One Marine later reported that a Ha-Go, leaking oil heavily from .30 caliber bullet holes in its engine compartment, soaked him completely as it passed over his position. He remained absolutely still until it moved on, then emerged and threw a thermite grenade into the damaged engine compartment as the tank moved past. The tank began burning from the inside, the fire spreading to ammunition stored near the engine. Another Marine, lying low in his foxhole as a tank rolled over him, jumped out after it passed and jammed a wooden plank into the bogie wheels. The tank spun in place, tracks throwing dirt and vegetation, unable to move forward or backward. When the confused tank commander opened his turret hatch to see what was wrong, the Marine jumped onto the tank and dropped a thermite grenade into the open turret. The tank exploded from internal fires, all ammunition igniting in a massive fireball that sent the turret spinning through the air. By mid-morning on June 17th, the Japanese counterattack was over. 31 destroyed Japanese tanks littered the battlefield, counted by Marines walking through the area after the fighting stopped. Some sources suggest as many as 35 tanks were destroyed when including those knocked out by artillery fire beyond the immediate battle area. Perhaps 1,000 Japanese soldiers were dead, including many of the tank crews and the infantry who had advanced with them. For the Marines, the victory was significant but grim. They had stopped a major armoured assault, but the cost had been substantial. The 2nd Marine Division's commander later acknowledged that if the Japanese attack had succeeded, it would have been catastrophic for the division's fighting capability. But for Marines walking among the destroyed tanks afterward, examining the vehicles up close, a different truth emerged, a truth that would spread through Marine units across the Pacific like wildfire. The Japanese tanks were not the formidable war machines they had expected. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. A Marine officer called his men over to look at a destroyed Hago. He pointed to the holes in the armour. They were clean, round penetrations where .30 caliber bullets had punched through. The exit holes on the far side were slightly larger, rough-edged, where the bullets had torn through after crossing the interior. You could put your finger through some of the holes. Through others, you could see daylight from one side of the tank to the other. Inside the destroyed tank, the scene was worse. The cramped interior showed signs of multiple penetrations. The commander's position in the turret had no protective features, no armour that would stop even rifle-caliber fire at close range. The manual traverse for the turret consisted of a simple hand crank. The gun controls were rudimentary. There was almost no space to move. The hull machine gunner's position was a small cubby with minimal visibility. The driver had a crude periscope and a small vision port. Everything was cramped, crude by American standards, and utterly vulnerable to .30 caliber fire. Marines who had fought at Guadalcanal 2 years earlier remembered seeing Hagos there. At the time, with Marines equipped primarily with light weapons and no armour support of their own, the Japanese tanks had seemed threatening. But now, with proper equipment, with heavy weapons and their own armour, the Hago looked exactly like what it was. A light tank from the mid-1930s, adequate for its original design parameters, utterly inadequate for modern industrial warfare against a peer adversary. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese tank crews was profound. Those who were captured, whose disabled tanks left them with no choice but surrender, had to grapple with uncomfortable truths. Their tanks were not just outmatched, they were obsolete. The equipment they had trusted with their lives offered no protection against weapons the Americans used as standard infantry support. Intelligence officers interrogating prisoners noted a consistent pattern in their responses. The Japanese tankers expressed shock at American firepower. They talked about the quantity and quality of American equipment. They mentioned the casual abundance of ammunition and supplies they had witnessed. Many expressed feelings of betrayal, that their own leaders had sent them into battle with inadequate equipment while telling them they had technological parity. One veteran tank commander who had fought in China since 1937 told interrogators that he had believed Japan would win the war through superior fighting spirit and devotion to the emperor. After Saipan, after seeing his tank penetrated by machine gun fire, after watching American Shermans shrug off Japanese anti-tank fire, he knew that spirit could not overcome material disadvantages. Training and courage meant nothing when your equipment was fundamentally inadequate. When the armor that was supposed to protect you could be defeated by weapons every enemy soldier carried. When the gun that was supposed to give you offensive capability couldn't harm enemy tanks. When every engagement was predetermined by industrial capacity rather than tactical skill. These reports were compiled, analyzed, and sent back to commanders throughout the Pacific. The lessons learned at Saipan would inform Marine tactics for the rest of the war. Japanese tanks were not a serious threat. Standard infantry heavy weapons, particularly the .30 caliber M1919 machine gun with armor-piercing ammunition, were effective against them. Combined with bazookas, 37mm anti-tank guns, and Sherman tanks, Marines had overwhelming firepower against Japanese armor. Word spread through the Marine ranks quickly. You didn't need specialized anti-tank weapons to engage a Japanese tank. Your .30 caliber machine gun, firing armor-piercing rounds, would do the job at combat ranges. This knowledge changed how Marines approached subsequent island battles. The fear that came with facing armor, the concern about tanks breaking through infantry lines, evaporated. Japanese armor became just another target, and not a particularly dangerous one. The ballistics data from Aberdeen had been proven in combat. Theory matched reality. The Battle of Saipan continued for weeks after the failed tank attack. Marines and army troops fought their way across the island against fierce Japanese resistance. The terrain was brutal, ranging from flat sugarcane fields to volcanic cliffs to Mount Taposhao, which rose 1,554 feet above sea level. Fighting in caves, ravines, and gullies consumed men and ammunition. The island was declared secure on July 9, 1944. The victory at Saipan had strategic consequences that reached far beyond the island. With the Marianas in American hands, B-29 bombers could reach Tokyo. The psychological impact on Japanese leadership was severe. Emperor Hirohito recognized that American control of Saipan meant Tokyo would be bombed. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo resigned on July 18th. For the first time, Japanese media admitted the war was going poorly. For Japanese tank crews across the Pacific, Saipan was a turning point. Word of the battle spread through military channels. Tank units on other islands heard what had happened. They knew their equipment was inadequate. They knew American weapons could penetrate their armor. But there was nothing they could do about it. The tanks they had were the only tanks Japan could provide. Japan's industrial capacity simply could not produce modern tanks in meaningful numbers. The nation's factories were strained by years of war. Resources were limited, with American submarines cutting off access to raw materials from Southeast Asia. Strategic priorities focused on aircraft production for kamikaze attacks and on coastal defense artillery for the anticipated invasion of the home islands. Tanks were a low priority. Japanese engineers had designed better tanks. The Type 3 Shi-Nu, mounting a 75mm gun. The Type 4 Shi-To, with even heavier armament. But these existed primarily as prototypes and small production runs. Only 166 Chi-Nus were built during the entire war, 2 Chi-Tos. None saw combat. They were saved for the defense of Japan itself, never sent to the island battlefields where they might have made a difference. Meanwhile, American production capacity was almost incomprehensible by Japanese standards. The Detroit Tank Arsenal, built by Chrysler Corporation, was a purpose-built facility dedicated to tank production. In a single month at peak production, the arsenal's workers could produce over 400 Sherman tanks. That was more tanks in 1 month than Japan produced in an entire year, across all its factories combined. The arsenal was not alone in this remarkable production achievement. Fisher Tank Arsenal, built in Grand Blanc, Michigan, was another government-funded facility operated by General Motors. Fisher produced over 11,000 Shermans in multiple variants. American Locomotive Company in Schenectady, New York, converted from locomotive production to build thousands of Sherman tanks. Baldwin Locomotive Works in Philadelphia, Lima Locomotive Works in Ohio, Pacific Car and Foundry in Washington State, Prest Steel Car Company in Pennsylvania, Pullman Standard Manufacturing in Illinois, and Federal Machine and Welder in Ohio all contributed to Sherman production. 10 major manufacturers, plus countless subcontractors, producing components, tracks, engines, radios, optics, weapons. The industrial mobilization was unprecedented in human history. By the time production ended in June 1945, American factories had built 49,234 Sherman tanks. Japan produced approximately 2,300 Hagos over the entire course of the war, from 1936 to 1943, when production ceased. The ratio was more than 20-1, but even that understates the disparity, because American tanks were far more capable individually than their Japanese counterparts. Sherman tanks weighed 30 to 35 tons, depending on variant. They had armor ranging from 51mm on the hull front to 76mm on the turret mantlet. They carried 5-man crews with dedicated positions for each role. They had gyro-stabilized guns that allowed firing while moving. They had radio equipment in every tank, enabling coordinated operations. They were reliable, with tracks that lasted thousands of miles. The Sherman was not the best tank of World War II. It was outgunned by German Tigers and Panthers. But it was good enough, and it was available in overwhelming numbers. In the Pacific Theater, where it faced Japanese tanks designed in the mid-1930s, the Sherman was more than adequate. It was overwhelmingly superior. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.